Tylan Vasquez had worked at the border station for 11 years. In all that time, he had never seen a reading he could not explain. He was a sensor officer, and sensor officers did not panic. They read numbers, checked data, and filed reports. That was the job, and Tylan was very good at it. The Watcher's Crest was an imperial border station that floated at the very edge of vagary space. It was old. The metal walls had taken on a greenish tint with age, and the lights buzzed in a way no one ever bothered to fix. The station monitored the neutral corridor, a wide stretch of empty space that separated the Valori Galactic Empire from the wild, uncharted territories beyond. Nothing interesting ever came from the neutral corridor. That was what everyone said. That was what everyone believed until today. Tylan was halfway through his third cup of stimulant tea when his console made a sound. It was not the normal one. The usual alert was a soft chime that meant a cargo ship or a lost freighter had drifted too close to the border. This sound was deeper, longer. It was the alert the system used when something very large translated out of subspace. He set his tea aside and looked at the screen. The first thing he noticed was the mass reading. It was enormous. The number sat on his display like a bad joke. He blinked and leaned closer. The object that had just dropped out of subspace had the mass of a dreadnought-class warship. That was not possible. Nobody built dreadnoughts anymore. The Empire had not constructed one in over 1,000 years because nothing in the galaxy required that much firepower. The second thing he noticed was the energy output. This was the number that made him carefully put down his tea and sit up straight. The reading was 6 times higher than anything in the Imperial fleet. 6 times. Not twice, not 3 times, 6. Tylan did what any good sensor officer would do. He assumed his equipment was malfunctioning. He initiated a full recalibration of the sensor array. Took 4 minutes. During that time, he told himself the station was old, the equipment was old, and old equipment sometimes produced faulty readings. This was normal. This was fine. There was nothing out there that could generate numbers like that. Nothing in the known galaxy. The recalibration finished. He ran the scan again. The numbers were identical. His hand moved to the communication panel, and he pressed the button for Commander Salon's quarters. It was the middle of the night cycle, and he knew she would not appreciate being woken. But Tylan had a rule. When the numbers did not make sense, you informed someone who outranked you. That way, when everything went wrong, it became their problem. Commander Dri Salon arrived on the sensor deck 12 minutes later. She was chith, tall, thin, and encased in a hard shell that clicked softly when she moved. She had 4 arms, all of which she used to express her displeasure at being awake. "This had better be worth my sleep, Vasquez," she said. Her voice sounded like dry leaves scraping together. "I'm not sure what it's worth, Commander," Tylan replied, gesturing to the screen. "But I've checked the readings twice." Salon leaned over his shoulder and studied the display in silence. For a long moment, she said nothing. Tylan could hear the faint clicking of her mandibles, which meant she was either thinking or angry. With the chith, it was often difficult to tell the difference. "Run a full spectral analysis," she said at last. "I want to know what that thing is made of." Tylan complied. The results came back in fragments, and each one made the situation more unsettling. The hull of the unknown vessel was composed of a steel-titanium alloy, primitive by modern standards. No advanced species used steel anymore. But layered over it was a carbon nanoweave of extraordinary density, and beneath that was something the database could not identify. The system labeled it an unknown crystalline lattice and offered no further explanation. "Steel," Salon said, as if the word itself offended her. "Who builds a warship out of steel?" "Someone who started with steel and kept building on top of it," Tylan answered quietly. Salon turned to look at him. She did not like that answer. It suggested something she was not ready to consider, a species that had begun with primitive materials and advanced with alarming speed. "Too fast. Has it transmitted anything?" she asked. "Not yet." "Wait." Tylan's console chimed again. "The ship's transponder is syncing with our translation systems." They watched the screen together as the software processed the signal, converting the unknown language into galactic common. The translation was rough, the grammar imperfect, but the meaning was clear. UNS Prometheus, Terran Unified Navy. Requesting open dialogue. Salon read the message 3 times before turning to a junior officer nearby. Pull up the species registry. Search for Terran. The junior officer, a young Bori with nervous eyes, quickly accessed the database. The file he found was small, as most Tier 9 species files were. There was rarely much to say about civilizations that had not yet left their own planet. Terran, also known as humans, he read aloud. Homeworld Earth. Sol System Outer Territories. Classification. Tier 9. Pre-spaceflight primitive. Last survey. 197 standard years ago. Technology level at time of survey. Chemical propulsion rockets. Fossil fuel combustion. Early nuclear fission. Notes. The species shows moderate intelligence but remains heavily divided into competing tribal nations. No unified government, no spacefaring capability. Projected time to interstellar travel. 400 to 600 years. The sensor deck fell silent. Tylan looked again at the mass reading. Then at the energy output. Then at the transponder identifying a Terran Unified Navy vessel. Finally, he glanced at the file describing humanity as pre-spaceflight primitives. That cannot be a human warship, Salon said flatly, as if stating an undeniable truth. The sky is blue. Water is wet. Humans did not have warships. The last time anyone checked, they had barely managed to leave their own atmosphere. The idea that they had constructed something producing 6 times the energy of an Imperial capital ship was not just unlikely, it was absurd. Run the scan again, Salon ordered. Tylan did. For the 3rd time, the numbers did not change. They never changed. The object in the neutral corridor was real, massive, powerful, and broadcasting a human identifier. I need to contact the 9th Fleet, Salon said, straightening as her shell clicked with finality. Admiral Jur needs to see this. Admiral Kathos Jur commanded the 9th Expansion Fleet, and he was exactly the kind of person Tylan did not want involved. Jur was old even by Valori standards. His scales had faded from green to dull gray, and his eyes carried the weight of someone who had spent too many years being right and had forgotten what it meant to be wrong. He was a supremacist in the old imperial tradition. He believed the Valori were the greatest species in the galaxy, and that all others fell somewhere on a spectrum between useful and irrelevant. Humans, if he had ever considered them at all, likely ranked far below even that. The communication was brief. Salon transmitted the sensor data, the transponder signal, and the spectral analysis. She explained that the readings had been verified multiple times and appeared accurate. Admiral Jur's response arrived 14 minutes later. He was laughing. Tylan could hear it clearly in the audio. The old admiral was genuinely amused. Commander Salon, Jur said, his tone that of someone explaining something obvious to a child. I have reviewed your data. What you have detected is most likely a derelict vessel that some primitive species has attached an oversized reactor to. The energy readings are impressive, I grant you, but energy is not capability. A fire burns hot, but it does not think. These humans, if that is what they are, have likely built themselves a very large, very loud toy and are now parading it around the galaxy, hoping someone will be impressed. There was a brief pause before he continued. I am dispatching Patrol Group 7 to intercept. 12 Cathri-class cruisers should be more than sufficient to escort these primitives back to whatever corner of space they crawled out of. If they resist, Commander Vin has my authorization to use appropriate force. This matter does not require further attention from this command. Jur out. The message ended. Salon stood very still for a long moment. Tylan watched her in silence. You reviewed the spectral analysis? She asked finally. No, Commander, Tylan replied quietly. He didn't. The crystalline lattice in the hull, the layered shielding signatures, the reactor output, none of it fit the Admiral's easy dismissal. No, Salon repeated softly. She turned toward the viewport. Beyond the thick glass, there was nothing but distant stars. The Prometheus was out there somewhere, too far to see with the naked eye, but undeniably real. Waiting. 12 cruisers, she said under her breath, the words carrying the weight of doubt. like someone counting paper boats before a storm. Tylan glanced back at his console. The energy readings from the unknown vessel had been rising steadily since its arrival. At first, he had assumed it was another sensor error. It wasn't. The ship was powering up. Systems that had been dormant were coming online one by one. The numbers kept climbing. A cold realization settled in his stomach. What they had been observing before was not the ship at full strength. It had been idle, resting, sleeping. Now it was waking up. Somewhere in the darkness between the stars, 12 Valori cruisers were making their jump into the neutral corridor. Their crews were likely relaxed, maybe even joking about the assignment. Escort duty for a primitive species that had wandered too far. Easy work. Something they would finish quickly and forget even faster. Tylan picked up his tea. It had gone cold, but he drank it anyway. He had a feeling it was going to be a very long night. On his screen, the energy readings continued to rise. The Prometheus was waiting. Commander Vin and Patrol Group 7 had no idea what they were flying toward. In the quiet halls of the Watcher's Crest, Commander Salon returned to her quarters. She did not sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the wall, thinking about a species that had gone from burning dead plants for fuel to building a warship that made the entire Imperial fleet look like children's toys. They had done it in less than 200 years. She thought about what kind of species could achieve that. Then she thought about what kind of fear would drive them to do it. She did not sleep at all that night. And when the reports began arriving from the neutral corridor the next morning, she was not surprised. She had seen the readings herself. And the readings had been very, very clear. Whatever was coming, the Empire was not ready for it. Not even close. Patrol Commander Essex Vin stood on the bridge of the Fong of Dominion and felt completely at ease. He was young for his rank, his scales still a vibrant green, his eyes sharp and ambitious. He had earned his position through a combination of talent and political connections, and he wore his uniform with confidence, as if it had been made specifically for him. In his mind, he was already an admiral. He just needed the right moment to prove it. This mission, he decided, was not that moment. But it was easy duty, and even easy duty looked good on a service record. The 12 Cathri-class cruisers of Patrol Group 7 dropped out of subspace in perfect formation. It was something Vin had drilled into his crews relentlessly. The execution was flawless. 12 ships, each 1.2 kilometers long, arranged in a standard encirclement pattern. Their hulls shimmered in dark purple, and their plasma lances glowed faintly along the weapon rails. They were beautiful machines, and Vin took pride in them. Each one carried enough firepower to strip a small moon down to bare rock. "All ships report ready, Commander," his communications officer said. "Good," Vin replied, clasping his hands behind his back as he looked out at the main viewport. "Where is our guest?" The sensor officer pointed to the display. A single contact sat ahead of them, motionless in the empty expanse of the neutral corridor. On the screen, it was nothing more than a small blip. Unremarkable. "Open a channel," Vin ordered. "Standard Imperial warning." He straightened slightly and spoke in a firm, commanding tone. "Unidentified vessel. This is Patrol Commander Essex Vin of the Valori Imperial Navy. You have entered restricted space. You are ordered to power down your weapons, transmit your navigation logs, and prepare to be escorted out of this sector. Failure to comply will be met with force. You have 60 seconds to respond." He was pleased with how it sounded. He had practiced it many times. The seconds ticked by. Vin waited. The bridge crew waited. After 40 seconds, the communications officer spoke again. "Commander, the vessel is responding. Audio and visual. Put it on screen." The main display flickered, then stabilized, revealing something Vin had never seen before. A human face. The woman appeared to be in her middle years, though it was difficult to judge with an alien species. She had dark hair pulled tightly back, brown skin, and a thin scar running from her left eyebrow down to her cheek. Her expression was calm. Not fearful, not hostile. Just calm like deep water. "This is Captain Lena Vasquez of the United Nations ship Prometheus, Terran Unified Navy," she said. Her galactic common was far better than the transponder's translation had suggested, though her accent was sharp and unfamiliar. "We are on a peaceful diplomatic mission to the Valori High Conclave. We carry no hostile intent. We request passage and an audience with your government." Vin studied her carefully. She did not look like what he had expected, though he wasn't sure what he had expected. The registry described humans as soft-skinned mammals with no natural armor, no claws, no venom, nothing particularly threatening. And yet, there was something in her eyes that unsettled him. It was the look of someone who had seen violence and come to terms with it long ago. "Your request is denied," Vin said firmly. "You will power down and submit to escort. This is not negotiable." "I understand your position, Commander," Vasquez replied calmly, "but I must respectfully decline. We have traveled a very long way, and we will not be turning back. I would prefer to resolve this through dialogue." A flicker of irritation crossed Vin's expression. He was not accustomed to being refused. He was about to respond when his sensor officer interrupted. "Commander, I have visual on the target." The officer's voice had changed, quieter now, tense. "Put it on the secondary display." The secondary screen activated, showing a magnified image of the human vessel. Every sound on the bridge stopped. The Prometheus was enormous. It stretched 4.7 kilometers in length. Vin's mind struggled to process the scale. His own flagship measured only 1.2 kilometers. The Prometheus was nearly 4 times larger. It loomed in space like a carved mountain shaped into a weapon. Its hull was angular and severe, all sharp edges and flat planes, designed with a single, unmistakable purpose. There were no elegant curves, no decorative features. It was brutally functional, honest in its intent, and it was covered in weapons. Thousands of them. Turret mounts lined the surface in precise, terrifying rows. Missile bays, point defense clusters, and along its spine, massive structures whose purpose Vin could not identify, but whose sheer size made his stomach tighten. "That is not possible," Vin whispered. "Commander," the sensor officer said, his voice now trembling slightly, "I'm detecting layered shielding, multiple overlapping energy barriers. Our records indicate that layered shielding is still theoretical. No species has successfully deployed it." "And their reactor?" Vin asked. The officer hesitated, checking his readings again. "The output is approximately 6 times greater than our most powerful capital ship." Silence filled the bridge. Across 12 cruisers and 1,200 crew members, not a single sound was made. Vin stared at the Prometheus, then at his fleet arranged around it in perfect formation. For the first time, he felt the faintest hint of doubt. It was like bringing a blade to a battle, and realizing too late that the opponent had brought a volcano. But he had his orders. Admiral Jur had authorized force, and Essex Vin had not risen this far by hesitating. "All ships," he commanded, his voice steady. "Fire warning volley. Plasma lances at 15% power. Target the space directly ahead of the vessel." 12 cruisers fired as one. Brilliant blue-white beams of plasma streaked across the void, converging just ahead of the Prometheus. A standard warning shot meant to demonstrate strength and resolve. The beams struck the Prometheus's shields and vanished. The beams were not deflected or scattered. They simply disappeared. The energy was absorbed into the shield matrix and vanished completely. Vin's sensor officer made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. "The shields absorbed our fire, Commander. All of it. Shield strength has not decreased. It has increased by 0.3%. Vin felt the blood drain from his face. He had fired on the human vessel and made it stronger. The communications console chimed. Captain Vasquez appeared on screen again, unchanged, calm, patient. "We'll count that one as a greeting," she said. "The next one we won't." Vin's first officer, a scarred veteran named Torath, leaned closer and spoke quietly. "Commander, I strongly recommend we contact Admiral Jur and request new orders. This is not what we were told to expect." Vin should have listened. Any reasonable officer would have. But in that moment, Vin was not reasonable. He was embarrassed. Embarrassed that his warning shot had been swallowed as if it were nothing, embarrassed that an alien woman was looking at him with something dangerously close to pity, and embarrassed that his entire bridge crew had witnessed it. "All ships," Vin ordered, his voice tight and cold. "Full broadside. All weapons, fire." The 12 Cathay-class cruisers unleashed everything they had. Plasma lances at full power, kinetic accelerators, missile batteries, enough combined firepower to crack a planet's crust. The void between them and the Prometheus turned white with energy. For a moment, nothing could be seen. Then the light faded. The Prometheus remained untouched. Its shields shimmered faintly, like ripples across still water, nothing more. And then it moved. It should not have been able to move like that. A vessel of that size, 4.7 kilometers long, with the mass of a small asteroid, should have been slow, deliberate, predictable. That was how physics worked. That was how the universe worked. The Prometheus did not care. It accelerated so quickly that half the sensor displays glitched trying to track it. One moment it was ahead of the formation. The next, it was among the cruisers, weaving effortlessly through them like a fish slipping between stones in a stream. Point defense turrets swatted incoming missiles aside as casually as brushing crumbs from a table. Plasma beams curved along the geometry of its shields and dissipated into nothing. The entire engagement lasted 11 seconds. In those 11 seconds, the Prometheus repositioned itself at the center of the formation, surrounded by all 12 cruisers, without firing a single shot. It had simply demonstrated that it could go wherever it wished, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. On the bridge of the Fong of Dominion, Vin gripped the railing so tightly his claws left marks in the metal. "Commander," the sensor officer said, his voice now flat, the tone of someone whose mind had shut down all unnecessary emotion. "Their shields are at 97%. Our entire barrage reduced them by only 3%. 3%. 12 warships. Every weapon they had. 3%. Aboard the Prometheus, Commander Deshi Okafor stood at the tactical station, studying the incoming data with the mild interest of someone reading a weather report. Tall, composed, with close-cropped gray hair, he had personally designed the ship's combat doctrine and spent years running simulations against every known alien weapon system. This engagement was unfolding almost exactly as predicted. "Their weapons are energetic but crude," he said calmly to Vasquez. "Designed to overwhelm through volume, not precision. Against our adaptive shielding, they're ineffective. They can't hurt us." Captain Vasquez remained seated in her command chair. She had not raised her voice or even stood during the attack. She had watched 12 warships unleash everything they had, and felt nothing but a quiet sadness. She had not come here to fight. She had come to talk. But conversation required understanding. "One turret," she said. "Forward battery 7. Lowest power setting." "Lowest power confirmed," Okafor replied, entering the command. A single turret on the forward hull rotated and locked onto the Fong of Dominion. It was one of the smallest weapons on the ship, typically used for point defense. Okafor reduced its output to the absolute minimum 0.1% of its full capacity. It fired. A thin beam of white-blue light lanced across space, perfectly focused, impossibly precise. It struck the Fong of Dominion at its midsection. There was no explosion, no flare. Cut. The beam sliced through the cruiser's hull as cleanly as a hot wire through soft wax, dividing the ship into two halves. The cut was so precise that emergency bulkheads sealed instantly on both sides. Atmosphere remained intact. Power systems continued functioning. Artificial gravity held. Not a single crew member was killed. Not one was even injured. The ship had been split in two with surgical precision. Vin found himself in the forward half of his vessel, floating under emergency lighting. The bridge glowed red. Through the viewport, he could see the aft section drifting slowly away, its severed edge still glowing faintly with residual heat. It was the most beautiful and the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. The communication system remained active. Captain Vasquez's voice filled the bridge. "Humanity does not want war," she said. Her tone was steady, unshaken. But we are done being surveyed, catalogued, and ignored. We have been watching the stars for a long time. Now we are here." She paused, then continued. "Take us to your conclave." Across all 12 ships, no one spoke. There was nothing left to say. They had unleashed everything they had and achieved nothing. In return, the humans had fired once at minimum power and cut a cruiser in half without harming a single life. The message was unmistakable. It was the loudest silence the galaxy had ever heard. Vin drifted in the wreckage of his bridge, staring out at the Prometheus. It loomed beyond the viewport, massive, silent, patient. Its weapons had powered down. The shields still shimmered faintly. We were not alone. And the beings who shared the galaxy with us were so far ahead that the difference was almost meaningless, like an ant discovering giants. The ant cannot fight the giants, cannot hide from them. It can only hope they never decide to step on it. Zhao's gaze swept across the chamber. Humanity did not accept that. A unified scientific initiative was created in total secrecy, the Black Vault program. It became the largest and most ambitious project in human history. Every major nation contributed. For the first time, our entire species worked toward a single purpose: survival. The program was led by a physicist named Arav Mishra. He was the kind of man who looked at an impossible problem and refused to believe it was impossible. He gathered the brightest minds on Earth and gave them one directive: take the alien technology apart, understand it, and then build something better. They did not simply reverse engineer the probe. That would have been enough for most species. They would have copied what they found. But humans are not logical. We were afraid. And fear did something unexpected. It did not make us cautious. It made us creative. Every piece of alien technology became a starting point, not a solution. We looked at Valori plasma reactors and said, "This is clever but insufficient." We examined subspace drives and said, "This works, but it is too slow." We analyzed hull alloys and said, "This is strong, but it will fail." And then we improved them. In 40 years, we matched the probe's technology. In 80, we surpassed it. In 120, we developed systems its creators had never imagined. The contained stellar fusion reactor was our invention, holding a fragment of a star within a magnetic field the size of a room. The crystalline hull lattice was our creation, grown molecule by molecule, stronger than any natural material capable of self-repair. The layered shield matrix was ours as well. While others considered it theoretical, our mathematicians solved the problem on a blackboard. The one who completed the equation was 26 years old. And we did all of this in silence. No transmissions, no expansion, no colonies. For 2 centuries, humanity hid. We built our fleet in the frozen darkness of the Oort cloud, far beyond the reach of observation. We trained, we tested, we prepared, and we waited. Zhao fell silent. The chamber remained utterly still. 1,000 representatives sat frozen in place, struggling to comprehend what they had just heard. Speaker Orth was the first to respond. His voice was low, like wind through ancient wood. "You are telling us," he said slowly, "that your species advanced from chemical rockets to stellar-class warships in less than 200 years? "Yes," Zhao replied. "That is not possible. And yet," she said calmly, "here I am." Orth fell silent again, absorbing the weight of her words. Orth gestured to the conclave's chief analyst, a Valori scientist named Korth, who had been studying the data crystal on a portable console. Korth looked up, his face pale. "The data is verified," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "The Prometheus is one ship in a fleet of 300 dreadnoughts of similar capability. The Terran Unified Navy also fields approximately 4,000 smaller vessels, including destroyers, frigates, and fast attack craft." He paused, glancing down at his console before continuing. "Based on the specifications provided, any single Terran dreadnought could engage and defeat our entire 9th Fleet." He looked up again, his expression strained. "Any single one," he repeated. "And there are 300. The chamber erupted. 1,000 voices rose at once, speaking in dozens of languages, all expressing the same disbelief. This cannot be real. This must be a deception. This must be a trick. But it was neither. The data was complete, transparent, detailed down to reactor schematics and weapon frequencies. The humans had withheld nothing. And that was what frightened Speaker Orth the most. A species that concealed its strength feared discovery. But a species that revealed it openly feared nothing at all. He raised his arms, and after a moment, the chamber fell silent again. Ambassador Zhao, Orth said, his voice steady. I must ask the question that everyone here is thinking. You have built the most powerful military force this galaxy has ever seen, in secrecy, in silence, in darkness. And now you stand before us, revealing everything, claiming you come in peace. He leaned forward, ancient eyes searching hers. If you possess such power, why come to us in peace? Why not take what you want? You could burn our worlds, shatter our fleets, end our empire in a single campaign. Why are you here, asking for dialogue? Zhao was quiet for a moment. She looked down at her hands, then back up at him. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, not weaker, but more honest. Because we know what it feels like to be alone and afraid, she said. We built all of this because we were terrified of you. Every ship, every weapon, every piece of technology came from the same place, fear. She let that settle before continuing. We looked up at the stars and saw an empire 12,000 years old that had catalogued us like insects. We didn't know if you would return. We didn't know if you would decide our world was useful. And we were not. So we built. We built until we were certain that nothing in this galaxy could ever threaten us again. She paused, then spoke more softly. But we didn't build all of that to destroy you. We built it so we could stand here as equals and say this. She looked around the chamber. No species should ever have to look at the stars and feel what we felt. Alone, afraid, wondering if anyone out there cared whether they lived or died. We built a wall around ourselves because we had no choice. Now we're here to make sure no one else ever has to build that wall, including you. The chamber fell silent again. But this silence was different. The first had been shock. This was reflection, the quiet of 1,000 minds rethinking everything they believed. In a private observation booth at the back of the chamber, Admiral Kathose Jur sat alone, listening through a secure relay. The full technical readout from the data crystal glowed on the console before him. He had read every line, checked every figure. His hands trembled. Jur was old, older than most species' entire lifespans. He had commanded fleets, crushed rebellions, enforced the will of the Empire across countless worlds. He had never feared anything. Fear was for the weak. But now he was afraid, not of the ships, not of the weapons, not even of the impossible technology. He was afraid because he understood what Zhao had said. They had built all of this from fear. Jur had used fear as a weapon his entire career. He knew what frightened species could do when cornered. But he had never seen a species that feared the entire galaxy. He had never seen a species that looked at the universe itself and declared, "We will not be victims." He stared at the data again. 300 dreadnoughts, 4,000 support vessels. Technology his engineers could not even comprehend. And all of it created in 200 years, while his empire had taken 12,000 to reach its current state, and then stopped advancing. His hands would not stop shaking. Quietly, without informing anyone, he opened a channel to the 9th Fleet. "All ships," he said, his voice steady despite everything, "stand down from combat readiness. Power down weapons. Return to standard patrol formation. This is not a drill." He gave no explanation, offered no justification. He simply issued the command, closed the channel, and sat in the dim booth, listening as Ambassador Zhao began outlining the terms of a new relationship between humanity and the galaxy. Far away, in the cold silence of the neutral corridor, the Prometheus still waited silent, patient. Its weapons powered down, its shields humming softly. A fortress built by frightened children who had grown up and chosen restraint. The stars burned around it, and for the first time in 12,000 years, the galaxy held its breath. In the weeks that followed Zhao's address, the Valori Galactic Empire reacted as all great powers do when faced with something beyond their control. It argued with itself. The conclave fractured into factions. Some called for alliance. Others demanded isolation. Some denied the threat entirely, hoping ignorance would make it disappear. And some wanted war. Counselor Veth Skal wanted war more than anyone. Pure-blooded Valori and proud of it, Skal had been a general before entering politics. He still wore his military decorations on his conclave robes, a reminder that his authority had been earned through blood, not rhetoric. Tall, with bronze-scaled skin and a commanding presence, he spoke with the certainty of someone accustomed to obedience. On the 7th day after first contact, he presented his argument. "You are all being deceived," he said bluntly. "The humans approach with smiles and open hands, and you reach out like children accepting sweets from a stranger. Ask yourselves, why would any species reveal its full military strength to a potential enemy?" He did not wait for an answer. "There is only one reason. Because they are hiding something greater. What they have shown us is what they want us to see. What they have not shown us is what should terrify you." A murmur spread through the chamber. 200 years ago, they were burning fossil fuels, Skal continued. Now they possess a fleet capable of destroying us. What will they have in another 200 years? 500? 1,000? Every day we delay, they grow stronger. The gap widens. If we are to survive, we must strike now, while their numbers are finite and their territory remains limited. It was a compelling argument, and, in a cold, logical sense, not entirely wrong. Several members nodded. The fear he invoked resonated because it already existed. Speaker Orth listened without interruption. When Skal finished, he simply acknowledged the position and moved to the next matter: cultural exchange. Because while the leaders debated war and peace, something unexpected was unfolding. Something far more powerful than any weapon humanity had built. Humanity had begun sharing its culture. It started as part of standard diplomatic protocol, an exchange of language, history, and art. The Valori had done it countless times with other species. It was usually uneventful. Human culture was different. The first sign came in the Conclave's Cultural Analysis Division. A junior analyst named Preth was assigned to catalog human music. He expected to finish in an afternoon. Took him 3 weeks. By the end, he had barely slept. The problem was scale. Humanity had not sent a sample, they had sent everything. Thousands of years of music, from primitive rhythms to complex orchestral compositions. Preth listened to a piece called Symphony No. 9 by a composer named Beethoven, and sat motionless at his desk for 20 minutes afterward, unable to speak. He was not sure why. The music had done something to him that he did not have words for. It had reached inside his chest and touched something he had not known was there. He was not the only one. The music spread through the capital like a fire. Copies of the human files were shared unofficially among analysts, students, and curious citizens. Within 2 weeks, Beethoven was being played in public spaces on Valor Prime. Within 3 weeks, human composers like Bach, Mozart, and a group called Pink Floyd were being discussed in academic journals. Within a month, a Kelith philosopher published a paper arguing that human music represented the most sophisticated emotional communication system ever developed by any species in the galaxy. But the music was only the beginning. The Conclave's literary division received the human fiction archive and did not know what to do with it. Other species had stories, of course, creation myths, historical epics, moral fables. Every civilization produced these. But humans had developed fiction into something no other species had ever imagined. They had created entire worlds that did not exist. They had written stories about people who had never lived, in places that had never been, facing problems that had never occurred. And they had done it with such skill and emotional precision that readers from completely alien species found themselves caring about characters who were not even real. A Dravathi librarian read a human book called Les Miserables and wept for 3 days. She had never wept before. Dravathi did not weep. Their biology did not support it. But her body found a way. A Viore military strategist read a human book called The Art of War, and then another called All Quiet on the Western Front. Afterward, he sat in his office for a long time, thinking about the fact that the same species had produced both. One was a manual for winning wars. The other was a plea to stop fighting them. Both were brilliant. Both were sincere. The strategist did not know what to do with a species that could hold both of those ideas in its mind at the same time. And then there was the humor. The galaxy had humor. Every species had some form of it. But human humor was different in a way that was hard to define. It was sharper. It was darker. It was capable of being cruel and kind in the same sentence. Humans made jokes about death, about suffering, about the meaninglessness of existence, and somehow those jokes made the darkness smaller instead of larger. The Kelith, who had no real tradition of humor in their culture, became obsessed with something called stand-up comedy and started hosting their own open mic nights in the capital. They were terrible at it, but they kept trying, which was itself very human. In the middle of all this, a human arrived on Valor Prime who would become the unexpected center of the cultural storm. Dr. Rena Solwyn was a civilian scientist from the Prometheus, a xenobiologist who had spent her career studying alien life forms through remote data and had never actually seen one in person. She was 41 years old, had curly red hair she never managed to keep under control, and she smiled at everything. She smiled at the architecture. She smiled at the food. She smiled at the aliens who towered over her and could have broken her in half with one hand. She asked questions constantly, not the sharp questions of an interrogator, but the excited questions of a child seeing snow for the first time. The conclave assigned her a liaison. His name was the Rick Milani, a young Kelith student studying interspecies communication at the Capital University. He was chosen because he was junior enough to be expendable, and because nobody expected the assignment to be important. He was wrong on both counts. The Rick met Dr. Solwyn in the diplomatic quarter on his first morning. She was standing in the middle of the street, looking up at the crystal towers of the Capitol with her mouth open. "This is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," she said to him before he had even introduced himself. The Rick was not sure how to respond. The crystal towers were old. Everyone on Valor Prime had seen them 1,000 times. Nobody thought they were beautiful anymore. They were just there, like the sky or the ground. "They are administrative buildings," he said. "I know," Dr. Solwyn said, still staring upward. "But look at the way the light moves through them. It is like they are alive." He looked at the towers. He had walked past them every day for 6 years. He had never once looked at the light moving through them. He looked now. She was right. It was beautiful. This happened again and again over the following days. Solwyn saw beauty in things he had never noticed. She found the patterns in Kelith shell markings fascinating and spent an hour sketching them in a small notebook she carried everywhere. She tasted street food and made sounds of such enthusiastic pleasure that the vendor gave her extra portions for free. She discovered that Dravathi elders hummed to themselves when they were thinking, and she stood near one for 20 minutes just listening, with an expression of complete peace on her face. The Rick found her confusing. She was a member of a species that had built weapons capable of destroying worlds, and she was delighted by street food. She came from a fleet of warships that could crush the Empire, and she was sketching shell patterns in a notebook. It did not make sense. On the 5th day, Solwyn gave him a small device. It was a rectangular object that fit in his hand, with a single button and a small speaker. "It is a music player," she said. "I loaded it with some things I thought you might like." The Rick took it back to his quarters that evening and pressed the button. The first piece that played was Beethoven's Symphony No. 9, 4th movement, Ode to Joy. He sat on his bed and listened. At first, he did not understand what he was hearing. The sounds were strange. Where Kelith music, what little of it existed, was rhythmic and sharp like the clicking of shells. This was different. It was layered. It built. It started quietly and then grew, adding voices and instruments, each one weaving into the others until the sound was so full that it seemed impossible it could all fit into such a small speaker. And then the human voices came in, singing, not in a language he understood, but it did not matter. The voices carried something beyond words. They carried joy, not the small, safe joy of a pleasant day or a good meal. This was the kind of joy forged in suffering. It was the joy of a species that had known darkness and had chosen, stubbornly and defiantly, to sing anyway. The Rick did not realize he was crying until the tears had already reached his mandibles. Kelleth did not cry often. It was not a common response in their biology, but his body did it anyway, the same way the Dravathi librarian had wept over a human novel. Something in the music bypassed every cultural and biological barrier and spoke directly to something deeper, something universal. He played it again and again. He played it 7 times that night and did not sleep. The next morning, he found Sol Win at her usual spot, staring at the crystal towers. "Why?" he asked. It was the only word he could manage. She looked at him. She understood the question. "Because we feel everything," she said simply. "Every emotion, all the time, all at once. Joy and grief and rage and love and fear. We cannot turn any of it off. So we learn to put it into things. Music, stories, paintings, dance. It is how we survive ourselves." The Rick thought about this. He thought about a species that felt everything so intensely that they had to invent art just to keep from being destroyed by their own emotions. And then he thought about that same species building the Prometheus, building 300 dreadnoughts, building weapons that could shatter worlds. They had built both with the same passion, the same intensity, the same desperate need to take what they felt and make it real. That was the thing the Empire had not expected. The warships were terrifying. The fleet was terrifying. The technology was terrifying. But none of it was as unsettling as the realization that the beings who had built all of those things were the same beings who had written symphonies and novels and poems about love and loss and the beauty of a sunset. The galaxy had seen powerful species before. It had never seen one that was powerful and beautiful at the same time. Counselor Skull felt his coalition crumbling. It was hard to convince people to go to war against a species when that species' music was being played in every public square in the capital. It was hard to call them monsters when their stories were making people weep with recognition, and their humor was making people laugh until they could not breathe. Every day, the cultural exchange chipped away at the wall of fear that Skull had been building. He grew desperate. On the 31st day after first contact, Skull made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He met in secret with a group of hardline military officers from the fringe territories of the Empire. These were not Conclave members. They were men and women who believed that the Empire's survival required action, not discussion. Skull gave them access to the old survey data for Earth's solar system, the same data that the Quiet Observer had collected 197 years ago. "The humans showed us their fleet," Skull told them. "But a fleet must have a home. Strike the home, and the fleet becomes a group of orphans with nowhere to return. Their home world is a single planet. Destroy it, and this problem goes away forever." It was genocide dressed up as strategy. The officers agreed. They assembled a stealth fleet of 200 ships drawn from reserve forces in the outer territories, ships that would not be missed immediately. They equipped them with the most powerful weapons available and programmed their navigation systems with the old survey data. Hours later, the fleet jumped to Sol. They arrived at the edge of the solar system and immediately dropped out of subspace, ready to begin their approach to the third planet from the star, ready to end the human threat forever. They found something waiting for them. Earth was surrounded by a defense grid. 10,000 autonomous weapons platforms hung in orbit around the planet and throughout the inner solar system. They were arranged in overlapping fields of fire that covered every possible approach vector. Each platform was roughly the size of an Imperial frigate, and each one carried weapons that the stealth fleet's sensors could not fully identify, but whose energy signatures suggested they were capable of cracking a planet's crust. 10,000 of them. The stealth fleet had barely completed its translation out of subspace when every single platform oriented toward them simultaneously. 200 ships detected in less than a second, targeted in less than 2. And then a message played across every communication channel the fleet carried. It was automated. It was not a voice that sounded angry or threatening. It was calm and clear, like a recorded announcement in a transit station. "You are seen. You are welcome to leave. You will not be warned again." 200 ships hung in the dark at the edge of a foreign solar system. 200 captains looked at their sensor displays and saw 10,000 weapons platforms pointed directly at them. The math was simple. The math was final. They turned around. Every single ship powered up its subspace drives and jumped back the way it had come. Not one of them fired a shot. Not one of them even considered it. You did not fight 10,000 automated weapons platforms with 200 ships. You did not fight them with 2,000 ships. You did not fight them at all. Skull received the news in his private chambers on Valor Prime. The fleet had returned. They had not fired a single weapon. Earth was untouchable. He sat in his chair and stared at the wall, and finally understood what Ambassador Jao had meant. The humans had not shown the Conclave everything. They had shown their fleet, their dreadnoughts, their offensive capability. What they had not shown was their defense. Because the grid surrounding Earth was not in the data crystal. The 10,000 platforms were not mentioned in the technical readout. The humans had given the Empire their sword to examine. They had kept their shield hidden, and the shield was larger than the sword. Somewhere on Valor Prime, in a public garden near the university, the Rick sat on a bench with his music player and listened to Beethoven for the 43rd time. The sun was setting, and the crystal towers were catching the light in the way Sol Win had taught him to see. He did not know about the stealth fleet. He did not know about the defense grid. He did not know that the galaxy had just come within minutes of a war that would have destroyed everything. He just sat and listened to the music, watched the light, and thought about a species that could feel everything all at once, and had somehow survived it. He thought they might be the bravest species he had ever heard of. Not because of their ships or their weapons or their shields, but because of the music. Because despite everything, despite the fear and the darkness, and the knowledge that the universe was vast and cold and did not care about them at all, they had still found a way to sing. Counselor Vaith Skull stood in the center of the conclave chamber in chains. They were not physical chains. The Vori did not use physical restraints on their own people. The chains were ceremonial bands of dull gray metal that hung loosely around his wrists and clinked softly when he moved. They were a symbol. They told everyone in the chamber that this man had been judged and found guilty, and that whatever he said next would be the last thing he said as a free person. Skull did not look broken. He stood straight. His bronze scales caught the amber light of the chamber, and his eyes were clear and hard. He had launched an unauthorized military strike against a sovereign world. He had assembled a secret fleet. He had attempted genocide. The evidence was beyond dispute. His own officers had testified against him. Speaker Orth read the charges in his slow, ancient voice. Each one fell into the silence of the chamber like a stone dropped into deep water. Unauthorized mobilization of imperial military assets. Conspiracy to commit acts of war without conclave authorization. Attempted destruction of a sovereign home world. Violation of the Neutral Corridor Accords. When the charges were finished, Skull was given the right to speak. This was tradition. Every condemned person was allowed final words. He looked around the chamber. 1,000 faces looked back at him. Some were angry. Some were sad. Some were afraid, but not of him. They were afraid because they knew, on some level, that what he had tried to do came from the same fear that lived in all of them. He had just been the one foolish enough to act on it. "I am not sorry," Skull said. His voice was steady. "I will not apologize for trying to protect this empire. You can call me a criminal. You can call me a warmonger. You can lock me away until my scales turn to dust. But I want you to remember one thing." He paused. He looked directly at Speaker Orth. 200 years ago, they were primitives. They had not even left their own world. In 200 years, they built a fleet that can destroy us. The words hung in the air. You are sitting here celebrating peace, listening to their music, reading their stories, and you are not asking the question that matters. What will they be in another 200 years? In 500? In 1,000? The chamber was silent. "You do not understand what they are," Skull said. For the first time, his voice carried something that was not anger. It was genuine, honest terror. "They are not a species. They are a force. They do not stop. They do not plateau. They do not reach a level and settle there the way every other civilization in this galaxy has done. They keep going. They keep building. They keep advancing. And one day, whether it is in 100 years or 1,000, they will be so far beyond us that we will be to them what insects are to us. He looked around the chamber one final time. I tried to stop that, he said. I failed. A crime you will all live long enough to wish I had not failed to commit. He said nothing else. The guards led him away. The chamber remained silent for a long time after he was gone, because he was right. Everyone knew he was right. Not about the genocide, that was monstrous and no one in the chamber would defend it, but the question he had asked was real. And it sat in the center of the room like a crack in the floor everyone was trying to step around. What would humans become in another 200 years? It was Speaker Orth who finally broke the silence. He rose slowly, his old bark skin creaking, and spoke in the voice of someone who had lived long enough to know that fear was the worst possible foundation for a decision. Counselor Skull asked the right question, Orth said. What will the humans become? I do not know. None of us can know. But I know this. The answer depends on what we do next. If we treat them as enemies, they will become enemies. If we try to contain them, they will break free and remember that we tried. If we ignore them, they will grow beyond us in the dark, just as they did before. He looked around the chamber. Or we can do something this empire has never done in 12,000 years. We can treat another species as an equal, not because we must, not because they forced us, but because it is right. And because the alternative is a future where the most powerful species in the galaxy remembers that we tried to destroy their home. The chamber stirred. Orth raised one arm for silence. Ambassador Shao has asked to address the conclave one final time. I believe we should hear her. Elena Shao walked to the center of the chamber for the second time. She looked different than she had during her first address. Not older exactly, but more worn. The weeks since first contact had been long for everyone, humans included. Meetings, negotiations, arguments, late nights that blurred into a single exhausting stretch of time. But her eyes were still clear, and her back was still straight. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what she was going to say and why it mattered. I have listened to Counselor Skull's words, she said, and I want to tell you something that might surprise you. He is not wrong. The chamber went still. Humanity will continue to advance. We will develop new technologies. We will expand. We will grow. That is what we do. It is what we have always done. We cannot stop it any more than you can stop a river from flowing downhill. In another 200 years, yes, we will almost certainly be more powerful than we are today. Counselor Skull is right about that. She paused. But he is wrong about what that means. Because power is not the same as intent. A knife can cut bread or it can cut flesh. The knife does not choose. The hand that holds it chooses. And we are here today to tell you what we choose. She reached into her uniform and pulled out a second data crystal. It was smaller than the first, glowing with a warm golden light instead of blue. This contains a formal proposal from the Terran Unified Government. We call it the Galactic Compact. She held the crystal up so the chamber could see it. It is not a treaty of submission. We will not submit to anyone ever again, and we would never ask you to submit to us. It is not an alliance of convenience that we will abandon when it no longer serves our interests. It is a compact, a promise, a binding agreement between equals. She set the crystal on the podium. The terms are simple. Humanity will share its technology with every signatory species freely and without conditions. Our fusion reactors, our shield systems, our medical advances. Everything we have built in 200 years of fear and determination, we will give away. Any species that signs the compact will have access to everything we know. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the chamber. Shao waited for it to pass. In addition, humanity will commit its military forces to the defense of any signatory species that is attacked. An attack on one will be treated as an attack on all. No species in this compact will ever face a threat alone. She paused again. In return, we ask for one thing. Her gaze moved across the chamber. Never catalog a species as beneath you again. The words were simple, quiet, and they hit the chamber like a physical force. No more tiered classifications. No more surveying a world, writing primitive in a file and moving on. No more looking at a species that has not yet left its planet and deciding they do not matter, because we were that species. We were the ones in the file. And we remember how it felt. Her voice did not waver. It did not rise. Stayed calm, clear and certain. Every species matters. Every world matters. Every civilization struggling to build its first fire or launch its first rocket matters, because you do not know what they will become. You did not know what we would become. And if we had been less lucky, if we had not found that probe, we might still be on Earth right now, looking up at the stars and wondering why no one ever came back. She stepped back from the podium. That is our offer. Technology, protection, partnership in exchange for the promise that this galaxy will never again treat a young species as something to be filed away and forgotten. That is what humanity wants. That is all we have ever wanted. Speaker Orth was quiet for a long time. The amber light of the chamber moved slowly across his bark-like skin, and his ancient eyes were wet with something the Dravathi did not have a word for. Finally, he spoke. Ambassador Shao, you come from a species that was once terrified of us. You built weapons that could destroy everything we have built in 12,000 years. And now you stand before us offering to give it all away. Forgive an old man for asking, but I must understand why. Why would you surrender the very advantage that makes you untouchable? Shao smiled. It was a small smile, tired, real and warm. Because we have been the ones looking up at the sky, she said. Terrified and alone, wondering if anyone out there cared whether we lived or died. We spent 200 years building a wall around ourselves because we had no choice. But a wall keeps you safe, and it also keeps you alone. She paused. We are tired of being alone, Speaker. We are tired of being afraid. She looked up at the vast crystal ceiling of the chamber. We built all of this so we could stand here today and say, the wall is open. Come in. We will keep you safe. And in return, we ask you to do the same for everyone who comes after us. That is the deal. That is the compact. The vote was not unanimous. 17 species voted against the compact, most aligned with Skull's faction, or bound by pride that would not allow them to accept gifts from a civilization still labeled primitive within living memory. But the majority was overwhelming. 83 species voted in favor. The Galactic Compact was signed in the amber light of the conclave chamber. And when it was done, Speaker Orth and Ambassador Shao clasped hands at the center of the room. The chamber erupted in a sound that had not been heard there in a very long time. Applause. Not polite, formal applause, real applause. The kind that comes from relief, from hope, and from the feeling that maybe things were finally going to be better than they had been before. The news spread across the galaxy like light. In the months that followed, everything changed. Human engineers arrived on 100 worlds, sharing fusion technology with species that had been using plasma reactors for millennia. Medical teams brought treatments for diseases that had plagued civilizations for centuries. Agricultural scientists helped terraform barren moons into living gardens. Educators developed cross-species learning programs that allowed children from different worlds to study together. And the humans kept advancing. Skull had been right about that. They did not stop. Within the first year of the compact, human researchers had already improved their fusion systems and shared the upgrades immediately. Within 3 years, they solved a subspace physics problem that had stumped Imperial scientists for 800 years and published the solution openly, free for anyone to use. But something else happened that no one had predicted, not even the humans themselves. The other species started advancing too. Exposure to human creativity, human problem-solving, human stubbornness, and refusal to accept impossibility. It was contagious. Valori scientists who had not published original research in centuries began experimenting again. Kelith engineers who had been content with existing designs started pushing boundaries. Dravathi philosophers, long settled into tradition, began asking dangerous questions. The galaxy was waking up, not because humanity forced it to, but because humanity reminded it that the universe was still full of mysteries, and that solving them was the most exciting thing a thinking mind could do. 50 years passed. On a space station drifting between 3 star systems, once part of the neutral corridor, a university had been built. It became one of the first great institutions of the Galactic Compact, and eventually the largest center of learning in the galaxy. Students from every signatory species attended together, ate together, argued and laughed and struggled together. Professor the Rick of the Kelith stood at the front of a lecture hall. He was old now. His shell had faded from deep youth brown to a cracked, pale pattern of age. He moved slowly, using a cane carved from Dravathi heartwood. But his mind was still sharp, and his mandibles still clicked with thought. His class was full 40 students from 8 species. Valori, Kelith, Dravathi, 2 members of a younger uplifted species called the Koroth, and 7 humans. The Rick looked at them and felt something he had spent 50 years learning the human word for. Gratitude. Today, he said, I am going to tell you a story about the day everything changed. Some of you have heard parts of it. Some have read it in history texts. But none of you were there. He tapped his cane once. And I was. 50 years ago, I was a student. I was young. I was bored. I thought the universe had no surprises left in it. And then one day, a sensor officer at a border station detected something in the neutral corridor. Something that should not have been there. Something that did not match any known species in the Imperial database. The sensor officer's name was Tylan Vask. He was careful, precise, exactly the kind of officer you wanted at the edge of known space. He did what any good officer would do when readings made no sense. He checked them again. The Rick smiled. A Kelith smile, subtle, mandibles parted slightly, eyes narrowing. Humans in the room recognized it immediately. 50 years of shared culture had taught everyone how to read everyone else. He checked them twice, the Rick said, and they did not change, because the ship sitting in the neutral corridor was real. It was called Prometheus, and it belonged to a species the Empire had catalogued as pre-spaceflight primitives less than 200 years earlier. He let that sink in. The humans had done something that no one believed was possible. In the time it takes most civilizations to make small improvements to existing technology, they had gone from burning fossil fuels to building the most powerful warship the galaxy had ever seen. They had done it in secret. They had done it in the dark. And they had done it because they were afraid. He looked at the human students in the room. They looked back steadily. They had grown up in a galaxy where humans were respected, admired, and sometimes still feared. But they had not grown up in the dark, and they had not grown up looking at the stars and wondering if something out there wanted to destroy them. That was the gift their grandparents had given them. But here is the part of the story I want you to remember. The humans could have used their power to conquer. They could have burned the Empire's worlds and taken whatever they wanted. No one could have stopped them. They knew that. We knew that. And for a while, everyone in the galaxy held their breath, waiting to see what the humans would do. He picked up a small object from his desk. It was old and worn, the casing scratched and faded. A small rectangular device with a single button and a tiny speaker. A music player. The same one Dr. Rena Solwyn had given him 50 years ago. What they did, the Rick said, was play us a song. He pressed the button. The tiny speaker crackled, and then the opening notes of Beethoven's Symphony No. 9 filled the lecture hall. It was thin and fragile through the old device, but it did not matter. The music was the music. It had not changed in hundreds of years, and it would not change in hundreds more. The humans were never the monsters we feared, he said over the music. They were frightened children who built a fortress and then opened the door. They were a species that felt everything so deeply they had to invent art just to survive their own hearts. They were the ones who looked at the darkness and decided to sing. He let the music play for a moment. The lecture hall was silent. Some of the students were crying. The Koroth students, new to human music, had gone completely still, wide-eyed, shaken, unable yet to name what they were feeling, but certain it would stay with them for the rest of their lives. That is the story, the Rick said. That is how one ship changed the galaxy. Not with its weapons. Not with its shields. Not with its impossible reactor. It changed everything because the people inside it chose to be more than their fear. He turned off the player and set it down carefully. Class dismissed. The students gathered their things and left. The Rick remained at the front of the empty room, listening to the silence, remembering a day 50 years ago when he had sat on a bench in a garden on Valor Prime and heard Beethoven for the first time without understanding why it made him cry. Now he understood. As the last students exited, a human girl with dark hair and bright eyes lingered near the door beside a Valerie classmate with green scales who had been taking careful notes. She leaned in and whispered, just loud enough to be heard. "We also built a really, really big gun," she said. "Just in case." The Valerie student looked at her. Then he laughed. A real laugh, deep, honest, infectious. The girl grinned, and together they walked out into the corridor. The station was alive with movement. Students of 8 species heading to classes, cafeterias, observation decks where 3 suns could be seen setting at once. The air was full of voices in a dozen languages. Somewhere, human music played from a speaker. Somewhere else, a Kelith student was telling a joke he had learned from a human friend and getting the timing wrong, but everyone was laughing anyway. The galaxy was not perfect. It would never be perfect. There were still disagreements, tensions, old wounds that had not fully healed. But it was better. So much better than it had been. And it had all started with a single ship. A single sensor reading that did not make sense. A sensor officer who checked it twice. And a species that had been afraid of the dark and chose, against all logic and probability, to light a fire so bright the galaxy could not ignore it. The Prometheus was a museum ship now. It floated above the university station, preserved exactly as it had been on the day it entered the neutral corridor. Students walked its corridors, touched its hull, and tried to imagine what it had been like when the galaxy was still unknown and only cold silence stood between humanity and everything else. On its observation deck, a plaque had been installed by Captain Lena Vasquez on the day of decommissioning. It was simple, engraved in steel, because humans had always loved steel even after learning to build with light and crystal. "We were afraid," it read. "We built this. Then we opened the door." Below it, someone had taped a small handwritten note. No one knew who had placed it there or when. It had been there for years and no one had removed it. It read, "P.S. The guns still work." And far below the station, the stars burned on, unchanged, as they always had been, as they always would be.